Well, good afternoon once again. Last Sabbath, in the message that Mr. Tkach had given in Pasadena that was taped and played in the various churches, he focused in on the scripture in Proverbs 29:18 that where there is no vision, the people perish. But he that keeps the law, happy is he. Where there is no vision. Now, he commented on that quite a bit. I would like to focus on an aspect today that we can learn by way of example. I would like for us to take note of the lives of two individuals. Two men who were born at roughly the same time, may very possibly have even been born in the same year. Certainly born right around the same time. They were men whose beginnings were almost identical. Almost identical circumstances surrounded their birth and the circumstances of their birth. It was a rather remarkable occurrence that at the same time these two individuals were born in almost identical circumstances, grew to adulthood, grew to maturity with a certain expectations that were attached to them, certain things that they had been told. And yet the lives of these two men, upon coming to adulthood, took very different turns. Very different directions. The process of their lives, the things that they went through and experienced were quite a bit different. Now, what we will find is that one of these individuals, one of these individuals was a man who certainly loved riddles. And I'm going to give you a riddle about him. He was a man that had an affinity for riddles. And so we can summarize his life by way of a riddle. He was a man that was blind as long as he had eyes. He was a man who was blind as long as he had eyes. And he never really had the vision until he lost his sight. Now, who in the world would that be? A man who was blind as long as he had eyes, never got the vision, never saw the vision until he lost his sight. Now, the other individual was a man that maintained that sense of vision throughout his life. The lives of these individuals makes quite a contrast, and there are many lessons that we can glean for us today. Many lessons that we can glean in our own individual lives, many lessons that we can glean in terms of the history of God's work and God's people and God's church. Lessons that can very directly apply to us. Now, to pick up the story of these two men, we need to go back to the time of the Old Testament. Back to a time in the book of Judges when we read of the ups and downs of this period in Israel's history. It was a turbulent time. It was a time that in many ways could be compared to the settling of the West in the American frontier. It was a time of lawlessness. It was a time of ups and downs. It was a time when there were a lot of turbulence, a lot of turmoil, a lot of violence, a lot of unrest. It was a very difficult time in the history of the nation Israel. And it was in the context of this turbulent time, because as you go through the book of Judges, we find that the nation would go along and would be all right for a period of time. God would have raised up a judge who would govern them. And then, somehow, people grew a little bit lax, a little careless, a little lackadaisical, And when the judge died, they very quickly relapsed into the practice of whatever everybody around them was doing. And within a short time, God would send invading armies in, and these nations would, these surrounding tribes and groups would maraud, and they would pillage, and they would just in general wreak havoc and create problems until eventually the nation would really be crying out to God for deliverance, and God would raise up another champion, another hero. And the story of Israel during the book of Judges just goes up and down and up and down and up and down. It was in this context, right about the time of the death of Gideon. You remember the story of Gideon in the book of Judges, and God had raised up Gideon, who was a man that was not, in his own estimation, a bold warrior, but rather a rather timid sort of fellow, a man who was intimidated by the forces of the nations around. God raised up this man who lacked the confidence and the pride of self and glory in self. God raised up this man, used him in a very powerful way, used him in a miraculous way, delivered the nation and ruled the nation under Gideon for a period of time. Gideon died about around 1121 BC. And in the year of Gideon's death, a number of problems arose because there was not a clear succession. There was a son that Gideon had who sought to make himself king, and this created problems. The nation, any semblance of central administration in the nation ceased. There was a certain man who was the high priest of God in Shiloh, and had been a high priest for about 20 years at the death of Gideon. He was a man who was already advanced in years by that time. And as he was advanced in years, he was having his sons increasingly handle the responsibilities. And it was in this context, and very likely that same year, the year of Gideon's death, that these two individuals were born. If they weren't born that year, they were certainly born within a year or two of that period of time. The Philistines invaded Israel from the Mediterranean, from the western coast, and they invaded and made incursions into portions of the land of Israel. There were other tribes, other surrounding peoples that also made incursions from other directions, and there was a general period of chaos and of tumult and of oppression. It was in the midst of all of this confusion, in the midst of all of this difficulty, that Abimelech and Naomi and their sons had left Israel and gone into the land of Moab to at least have an area that had a little bit of peace. And you can read that story in the book of Ruth. But our concern, we will pick it up in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 1, because one of these men was the prophet Samuel, one of these men who was born in that fateful year of 1121 BC. We read that there was a certain man who was a Levite, whose family had originally been of the Levitical families that were attached to cities in the tribe of Ephraim. This man was Elkanah. He had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah, and he was coming up to the tabernacle at Shiloh to worship. He came up every year, and here he was, as we read here, coming up to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And this was during the priesthood of Eli. Eli was the high priest at this time, and had been for several years, at least about 20 years by this period of time. And his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were the ones who primarily carried out the priest's functions in Shiloh, because Eli, by this time, was in his late 70s. He was advanced in years to the point that much of the strenuous physical labor involved in the priesthood in terms of the sacrificing of the animals and some of these things it was very strenuous. His sons carried those responsibilities out, and Eli superintended everything. Now we find that there was a problem, that Hannah was unable to have children. And this had been a cause of distress to her, and made more so because the other wife of Elkanah, Peninnah, had several children, sons and daughters, and used to make disparaging comments to Hannah, and Hannah felt very badly about this matter. And we find that Peninnah enjoyed sort of baiting Hannah and teasing her in a way to so as to hurt her feelings and make her cry. We're told that in verse 7 here of 1 Samuel 1. We find that after one of these particular occasions, this very likely is the period of the Feast of Tabernacles, that Hannah arose in 1 Samuel 1:9 after they had eaten, and Eli was sitting on a seat by the post of the temple, or the tabernacle. He was in a chair that was elevated up. There were steps that led up, and he had a high seat there where he was able to supervise and to see what was going on. And Hannah sought a place over near the tabernacle, and she was in bitterness. And she prayed unto the Eternal and wept sore. And she vowed a vow. And she said, O Eternal of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your handmaid and remember me and not forget your handmaid, but will give unto your handmaid a man-child, I will give him unto the Eternal all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Now this was, of course, what was entailed, or part of what was entailed in a Nazirite vow. You can read of that back in the book of Numbers, that this matter of a Nazirite vow that is detailed there. Which was a vow of dedication. Normally it was a temporary thing taken for a month or 2 month or 6 month duration. But here was a vow, a Nazirite vow that was made referring to an individual who was to be a Nazirite from his mother's womb. So Hannah made a vow to God, and as she was praying, Eli was watching, and he noticed that her lips were moving, but she wasn't saying anything. She was obviously in distress, and her lips, she was talking, or he could see her, and yet she was not speaking aloud, and he thought that she had been drinking. He thought that she was drunk, and he chided her and told her that that was inappropriate. And she then answered him and said, I've not been drinking, I'm not drunken. I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit, and I have been pouring out my soul to the Lord. Don't count me as someone who is heedless of God's law and of reverence to God. So Eli, upon realizing that, told her to go in peace, and said, the God of Israel grant you your petition that you have asked of him. So she went her way and ate, and was no longer sad, having had assurance from the high priest that God would hear her. Well, they went back home, and in the process of time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Eternal. And Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. Hannah went not up. She said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him that he may appear before the Eternal and there abide forever. Now it was not uncommon, and still is not in certain cultures, that children not be entirely weaned until even 4, 5, 6 years of age. That is not completely uncommon at all, particularly in some of the Middle Eastern cultures. And so when she said that she was not going to bring him up until he would be weaned, she was not talking about bringing up a babe in arms, but obviously a young toddler, very likely on up at least 5 years of age, maybe 6, because she brought him up in the Feast of Tabernacles after his weaning, which would mean that even the better part of a year could have gone by following that before he was finally brought up there to the tabernacle. And when she weaned him, she took him up there, brought a sacrifice. The child was young, again, probably just a very young child, maybe around 5 years old, 5 or 6, something of that nature. A sacrifice was offered, and she brought the child to Eli and told him she was the woman that had been praying there several years earlier. And she said, I have prayed, and God has answered, and I have lent him to the eternal. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the eternal. And he worshiped the Lord there. Well, Hannah rejoiced in her heart for God's answer. And the child we're told, that Elkanah in 1 Samuel 2:11 went back to Ramah, to his house, and the child did minister unto the eternal before Eli the priest. So the little child, who was by this time old enough to be able to be taught there and to help out, originally, of course, doing very small, very simple little tasks, but nevertheless grew up there at the tabernacle. And we're told, of course, that Samuel, verse 18, ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. His mother had made him a little garment that was very similar to what the priest wore, that was just on a child's level. And his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him from year to year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife, and he said, the Lord give you seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to the eternal. And they went their way home, and God visited Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before the eternal. Now we're told that Eli's sons, in verse 12, were sons of Belial, and they knew not the eternal. In other words, they were completely wicked. They were absolutely uninterested in really serving God. They didn't know God. They had no personal acquaintance with God. They were not individuals who were sincere in their practice at all. In fact, we read here in verse 13 that they had derived the custom that when the sacrifices were made, instead of waiting and taking the priest's portion, that they would send a servant with a flesh hook to grab out the best part for themselves. And verse 15, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant came and said to the man that sacrificed, give flesh to roast for the priest, for he won't have sodden flesh of you, but raw. And if any man said unto them, well, no, let's not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take whatever you want, they would answer him, no, you give it now, and if you don't, we'll take it away from you. We'll take it by force. Now, can you imagine the state of things, the state of religion in Israel, to where the 2 individuals right under Eli, the high priest, were of such a corrupt nature that they were seizing the best part for themselves and were actually threatening the people that were coming up to sacrifice and to worship God, were actually threatening them, if you don't give it to us, we're going to take it away from you. We're going to beat you up and take the whole thing. Now, put your mind in picture here of people who are going up to worship God. And here are a couple of individuals who are administering God's government and through the priesthood, who are the men right under Eli, the high priest. We're told in verse 17, the sin of the young men was very great before the Eternal, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. You know, it made people not want to come up and involve themselves. We find that many things took place. In fact, Eli was old, verse 22. He heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So here they were seducing women that were coming up, trying to seduce them and involve them in illicit relationships, taking advantage of their office and the prestige and the power of their office. Here were individuals who were absolutely, totally corrupt. They were greedy. God calls them, He names them sons of Belial, which Belial is a term that refers to Satan. So He calls them sons of the devil. They were devilish in their ways. Eli heard about it and he told them, verse 24, my sons, it's no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sins against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearken not to the voice of the Father. The Lord, wherefore the Lord would slay them. God determined that He was going to wipe these two individuals out, that they would never succeed to the high priesthood. Now Samuel grew and was in favor both with the Lord and with men. Now as we come on down in chapter 3, we find that the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. There was no open vision. You know, we noted at the beginning, where there is no vision, the people perish. Mr. DeKoch made the point that vision has to do with a revealing of God's will. It has to do, that is a reflection of the way that God reveals His will, and that where there is no vision, where the revelation from God is either ignored or not present, that there is a way that leads to destruction that people are following. Well, God was normally, in these days, revealed Himself in certain ways through the priesthood, but there was no such thing and had not been for a period of time. One night when Eli had laid down, Samuel was laying down to sleep and was there in the adjacent compartment there to the tabernacle as an attendant there. According to the Jewish historian of the time of Christ, Josephus, Samuel was 12 years old at the time of this occurrence. We're told in verse 4 of 1 Samuel 3, the Lord called unto Samuel, and he answered, Here am I. And he ran into Eli, and he said, Here I am, you called me. And Eli said, No, you must be dreaming. You know, I didn't call you. You go lie back down. Go back to sleep. Well, he lay back down and dozed back off, and pretty soon he heard the voice again coming that called him by name. Samuel, Samuel. And he got up and he went running back in there to Eli again, thinking that Eli had called him, and this happened 3 times. And the third time, we're told that Eli perceived, in verse 8, that the Lord had called the child. Now understand the implications of this. Eli was the high priest, and it was the custom, and had been, that when God had anything to reveal, He revealed it through His priesthood. However, there had been a period of years where no vision was given. No vision was given. God had given no revelation through the priesthood for a period of years because of corruption. Here was Eli as an old man. Here was Samuel, a little 12-year-old boy. And it began to dawn on Eli that God was talking, God was dealing with His child, God was calling him in a way that he had not dealt with Eli in many years. And of course, the significance of that, because was there, Eli knew why. Eli was an individual who lacked the willingness to make the hard decisions that are sometimes necessary. Eli was unwilling to take the actions that he should have taken involving his own sons. They were his sons. And he overlooked things that should never have been overlooked. And the consequence was that there were problems that were caused for the entire nation. Well, we're told that Eli, in realizing this after the third time, told Samuel to go and lie back down. And he said, "If you hear the voice again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and he lay back down, and the Lord came and stood and called as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel answered, "Speak, for your servant hears." And the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of every one that hears shall tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all things which I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. Therefore have I sworn unto the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice nor offering forever." Samuel lay until the morning, and he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel feared to show Eli the vision. Samuel was afraid to go in and tell Eli what he had been told, because this was a dreadful thing. And Eli had undoubtedly been kind to Samuel, and Samuel was very concerned about having to actually look this elderly man, this high priest, in the eye and to tell him that God said, "Your family is going to be wiped out." Well, Eli called Samuel, and Samuel came in, and he said, What is it that God told you? Now, don't hide it from me. Tell me the truth. Tell me everything he said. And Samuel told him every whit, and he hid nothing from him. And we're told that Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again in Shiloh. For the Eternal revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Eternal. God dealt with Samuel. And there was a vision that God made apparent and made available. Now understand, here in the midst of turbulence, here in the midst of chaos and confusion, here in the midst of all sorts of iniquity that was going on right at the tabernacle in Shiloh, here was Samuel growing up in circumstances like that, and what did he do? He quietly obeyed God. He did what he ought to have done. The fact that Phinehas and Hophni were engaged in all sorts of illicit conduct didn't affect Samuel's relationship with God. Samuel did not allow what people were doing to interfere with his relationship with God. You know, that's unfortunately a tendency of human beings. We can tend to let what people do interfere with our relationship with God. Samuel did not allow that. Samuel was focused, even as a young boy growing up. Having been dedicated to God from the time of his birth, Samuel was focused in, and God was real to Samuel. And as Samuel sought God, God became more and more real to him, and God worked with him and helped him. And it became apparent all around, and all of the people who were really sincere coming up to Shiloh said among themselves, that Samuel, that young Samuel, God is going to work through that young man. You just wait and see. People would say to themselves, those who were really sincere in seeking God, and how it must have grieved them to come up from year to year and to see Phinehas and Hophni still there swaggering around, grabbing the things that they wanted, trying to see who they could seduce, engaged in such open and blatant corruption that it was a turn-off to everyone far and near. And yet there were those who came up sincere. And they took note of this young man, this young teenager, Samuel, and his sincerity and the reputation that he established by his conduct, which was above reproach. Samuel didn't go and try to set up a rival tabernacle somewhere else from Shiloh. He carried out the responsibility that God had given him where he was. Now, Israel went out against the Philistines to battle. The Philistines, following the death of Gideon 20 years earlier, the Philistines had invaded Israel from the western coast, the Mediterranean coast. And for a period of about 20 years, had conducted all sorts of raids, had lorded it over the Israelites, and had just in general made life difficult. And somehow there was no champion, there was nobody to overthrow the Philistines. The Philistines made life rough. So Israel went out against the Philistines to battle. They decided now at this point, we've come down about 20 years from the death of Gideon to 1101 BC, that Samuel would have been about 20 years old at this time, that the nation decided that they were going against the Philistines to battle, that they had had enough. And so the Philistines gathered themselves together, and Israel went out to battle against them. And the Israelites lost the battle. And when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? I know what let's do. Let's get the Ark of the Covenant out of Shiloh. And when it comes among us, it may save us out of the hands of our enemies." Notice the way that a superstitious approach had come in. True religion had been corrupted because those who were responsible for teaching, those who were responsible for upholding the truth, failed to do so. And because of that, a very superstitious approach had grown up to where when they lost the battle, instead of looking to repent and to wonder, if God's not blessing us, then what is it we need to change? They started looking for a good luck charm. Said, "Well, I know what. We get the Ark of the Covenant down here. Why, we'll take that out to battle with us. And then the Philistines will be defeated." So they sent to Shiloh. And Phinehas and Hophni were going to go down with it. Now, they were certainly individuals who were qualified to represent God. Well, they were nevertheless priests. And the ark came into the camp, and the people shouted. They were all excited. They thought this was going to solve their problem. Word got out among the Philistines. What's all the noise going on down at the Israelite camp? They said, "Well, their God has come among them." Because the Philistines, you see, their God was an idol, and they could carry it around, and they knew that this ark had great significance to the Israelites, and they assumed somehow the God of the Israelites must be in there. So the Philistines began to get worried, and they said, "This is the God that smote the Egyptians with all those plagues." And then they said, "Well, look, we're going to be defeated. We're going to go down like men. So let's all get together and do what we can." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, verse 10, and fled every man to his tent. There was a great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 infantry. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. And a Benjamite man ran back to Shiloh and came in, and Eli was sitting there on a seat by the wayside watching. He was very worried when he saw them take the ark. He had not wanted them to do so, and had a premonition of trouble. Because Eli knew better. Eli was a weak individual. He was a man who knew better, but he was unable to put his foot down. And his weakness led to destruction of everything that was important to him. And there is a lesson to be learned. There is no indication that Eli himself was personally corrupt. There's no indication that Eli stole the sacrificial offerings that were brought, or that Eli was involved in illicit relationships with the women coming up. No indication, no mention of that at all. What is mentioned is the fact that Eli was weak in that he allowed corruption among those under him and was unable to stand up and put his foot down, particularly where it involved his own children. And Eli was 98 years old at this time. He was not able to see. And the man came up and told him who he was. And Eli inquired as to what had happened. And the messenger said that Israel has fled before the Philistines. There was a great slaughter. Your 2 sons are dead, and the ark of God is taken. And when he said the ark of God is taken, Eli was absolutely stricken, very likely. Had a heart attack right at the time. Just fell off backwards off of the seat. His neck was broken. He died instantly. He had been in a responsible position. This was in 1101, and Eli had been in a responsible position in Israel for the last 40 years. Now the Philistines took the ark of God, and they brought it from Ebenezer unto Ashdod, one of their capital cities, and they took the ark and they brought it into the house of Dagon, and they set it there by Dagon as a trophy. Well, when they got up early the next morning, they found that Dagon was fallen on his face before the ark of the Lord. When you walked in, it looked like Dagon had bowed down to worship the ark, because their god, Dagon, this big fish god, was sitting up there on this great stone altar, and so they set the ark down over here. When they came in the next morning, here their God was fallen down on his face. It was as though somebody had taken it off of the pedestal on which it sat and put it face down there in front of the tabernacle, in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Well, they didn't like that. That looked bad, so they picked their God up and set him back up. And they got up early the next morning, and Dagon was fallen on his face to the ground before the ark, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. And only the stump of Dagon was left to it. So this is where the superstition of not stepping on the threshold grew up, we're told, in verse 5. And the hand of the Lord was heavy upon those of Ashdod, and he smote them with emerods, which is hemorrhoids. It's just an old King James term. This was quite a punishment to afflict them with. And everybody in Ashdod began to come down with hemorrhoids, and so they said, didn't take them too long to come to the conclusion in verse 7, the ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us. We're not keeping that thing here any longer. His hand is sore upon us and upon Dagon our God. So they sent and gathered all the lords of the Philistines and said, what are we going to do with this ark? And they said, well, let's take it down to Gath. Let's take it down to the neighboring city and say, what, we got to thinking it over, and we really don't think we deserve this great honor of having this ark here in our city. We're going to let you have it. So they took it down to Gath. And it was so that the hand of the Lord was against Gath with a great destruction. And he smote the men of the city, small and great, and they had hemorrhoids in their secret parts. And therefore they sent the ark of God to Ekron. They said, we need to pass this thing around. Really, it's not fair of us to just keep it here. We think so we're going to send it down to you. Now, needless to say, they didn't tell the next city, why they were sending it. They made it sound as though we're going to convey this great honor on you. Well, the word was already beginning to spread, though, and by the time it got to Ekron, the people said, uh-oh, no, you don't. They brought about the ark of the God of Israel to us to slay us and our people. So they said, look, we've got to get this thing out of here. We don't know where to put it. And so the verse 12, the men that died not were smitten with hemorrhoids, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. There was great pain and distress throughout the land of the Philistines. And the ark of God was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. And the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners, and they said, how do we get rid of this thing? Tell us how we're going to send it to its place. We don't know what to do with it. We've got it, and we don't know how to get rid of it. And so they said, well, look, if you send the ark to the God of Israel, you better not send it empty. You better return it with a trespass offering. And so they got their heads together to figure out what should they offer as a trespass offering. And so they decided that they would make 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden mice. Verse 4, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. For one plague was on you all and on your lords. And so they made images of the hemorrhoids, verse 5, and images of the mice that were epidemic through the land. And so they did this. And then they built a new cart. And they took 2 milk cows that had never been yoked up, and they tied these 2 cows to the cart. And they brought the calves of these cows back home with them. And the ark was laid in the cart, and they had jewels of gold that they were returning for a trespass offering, was put in a box next to it. And they said, let's see what happens. You know, what you would normally expect is, number one, you try to hitch up the 2 milk cows that have never been under the yoke, and they're not going to docilely submit. Any of you who've ever fooled with cattle, you try and hitch up something to pull a cart that's never pulled a cart, and they're probably going to tear the thing up, or at least give it a good try. You take a cow's calf and you go put the calf up, the cow is, he's going to be interested in getting the calf back. But these 2 cows didn't do that. The cows took the straight way to the way of Beth Shemesh. And they went along the highway lowing as they went. You can just hear them, they were bellowing for all they were worth. They knew their calves were gone, but somehow or another they were guided in the right direction, and they went exactly where they ought to go. They turned not to the left side nor to the right. And the lords of the Philistines went after them all the way to the border. And they saw the ark coming, and the Levites took down the ark and the coffer that was there, and they put them on a great stone, and they offered a sacrifice there. But we find that the Israelites in Beth Shemesh had less reverence for the ark than these pagan Philistines had had. They decided they wanted to come open up the lid and look in and see what was in there. And God smote the people. There were over 50,000 men that he smote and killed because of this absolute lack of reverence. Well, then they decided that they didn't want to keep the ark around there any longer. So they got some people from a nearby village, Kirjath Jearim, to come and fetch the ark, and they brought it to the house of Abinadab. And they kept it there. And it was there a long time, and it was 20 years. It was there for 20 years. From 1101, which was the death of Eli and the defeat of Israel, down to 1081. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. And at the end of this 20-year period, in 1081, Samuel spoke to the house of Israel and said, if you do return unto the Eternal with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve Him only, and He'll deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So here the situation dragged on over a period of time, on down another 20 years. So here the state of the nation, by this time, for a period of 40 years since the death of Gideon, had been in affliction. These are the 40 years that the Philistines ruled over the Israelites, and there were problems all the way around. There was not even an example of God's government being carried out as it really ought to have been. Some of those, such as the sons of Eli, were corrupt. Now, I mentioned that there was someone else who was born right at the same time as Samuel, because Samuel was born, we've already seen, probably the very year of Gideon's death. There was another birth that took place right about that same period of time. We go back to Judges 13 for that. We find that the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Eternal, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and she was not able to have children. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman and said, You're barren, but you will conceive and bear a son. Beware. Don't drink wine or strong drink, or eat anything unclean. You shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Now, this occasion, right about the same time that Hannah had made her vow to God, a vow that if God would grant her a child, she would make him to be a Nazarite from the time of his birth. Here we find going on elsewhere, going on in the northern part of Israel, an occasion that had some very distinct parallels. Here was another woman who was unable to have children. And here was an angel that appeared to her and said, You're going to have a child, and this child is to be a Nazarite. God has a special job for him. And we find that, as you can go through the story here, in verse 24, the woman bare a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. We find here is Samson came of age. Now, Samson came of age just about the same time that Samuel was coming of age. While Samuel was deepening his relationship with God, and God was beginning to speak to Samuel and beginning to speak through Samuel, we find that this other young boy who had grown up also as a Nazarite had grown up, and yet somehow his interest and his attention was turned elsewhere. And he went down to Timnath, and he saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and his mother, and he said, I've seen a woman in Timnath of the daughter of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife. And his father and mother said, Is there never a woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all the people, that you go to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? Now, the fact that they said, Is there never a woman, indicates that Samson had his attention continually on the women of the surrounding tribes. Now, this one he wanted to marry. His parents objected. They knew that that was not appropriate, that was not something God would approve of, and had instructed the Israelites about. And they admonished him to marry among his own brethren, his own people. And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Now, you don't quite get the sense of it here in this statement, but notice the very last word of the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 21 and verse 25, In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That statement summarizes the book of Judges, the most violent, bloody book in the entirety of the Bible. That in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Everybody just did his own thing. The words that Samson said right here in Judges 14:3. The English translation is slightly different, but in Hebrew it's identical. What he said was, Get her for me, for she's right in my own eyes. You see, that's exactly the problem. That was the problem throughout the book of Judges. People did what they wanted to do. They did that which was right in their own eyes. Samson said, well, she's right in my eyes. I'm the only one that I think needs to be pleased. Now his father and mother knew not that it was of the Lord. Now what does that phrase mean, of the Lord? There are many things that we could look at. I would just call your attention that it was of the Lord that He sought an occasion against the Philistines. The Philistines had dominion over Israel. They had by this time for about 20 years. Samson had shown no inclination to deliver Israel, to do what God had intended him to do. Samson had shown so far no inclination. In fact, his inclination was to fraternize with the Philistines and to try and entangle himself with some of the Philistine women. So God understood and God set the stage. You see, and here is an important lesson of faith, God's purpose will be accomplished in spite of people if necessary. God raised Samson up for the purpose of beginning the destruction of Philistine power. Now, this was of the Lord. If you go back and you read in the story later on in the book of Kings, you read at the time of King Ahab, that there was an evil spirit of the Lord, or from the Lord, that a lying spirit that came forth to lead Ahab into battle at the time of Ahab and Jehoshaphat when they went out to battle in Ramoth-Gilead. Now, that phrase, from the Lord or of the Lord, simply meant with God's permission. It was something God allowed, not necessarily something God caused. God allowed a demon spirit to go down there and deceive Ahab. You can go back and read the story we have before. God allowed it. We read at the time of King Saul that there was an evil spirit from the Lord or of the Lord that troubled Saul. That didn't mean that God sent the evil spirit. God didn't desire lies to be told and demon spirits to bother people, but God allowed it. God allowed it to accomplish His purpose. And here, God allowed this situation. God was allowing this to develop because He saw that the only way that Samson would ever take action against the Philistines was if he had a personal grudge to bear. Samson was not going to fight the Philistines because God told him to. But if Samson had a personal grudge, he would go to avenge himself. Samson was a very self-centered individual. He was a person who wanted to do what pleased him. He was an individual who was exceedingly strong. We'll notice. Samson went down to Timnath with his parents. A lion roared against him, and Samson slaughtered the lion barehanded. And anyway, as time went on a little later, a period of time later, and this was in a desert region in which the carcass would very quickly become desiccated, and so when they came back by, the carcass remains a matter of weeks later, that there was already a swarm of bees and honey was there in what had been the carcass of that lion. So Samson went down and to make a marriage feast with this woman, and he said in verse 12, I will put forth a riddle unto you. If you can declare it in the 7 days of the feast, I'll give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. If you can't, well, then you do the same to me. Put forth the riddle. And the riddle was, out of the eater came forth meat, out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not in 3 days expound the riddle. And they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband that he may declare unto us the riddle. If you don't, we're going to burn your place down. Well, she wept before him, and she said, You just hate me, you don't love me, you put forth the riddle, and you won't tell me. And so she whined and moaned for a week, and finally he told her the story. He told her the riddle, the key to the riddle. Immediately she told the people, and they came and said, on the seventh day, what's sweeter than honey and what's stronger than a lion? Samson said, if you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have found out my riddle. And so he went down to Ashkelon and slew 30 men, took their spoil, and gave changes of garment unto those that expounded the riddle. And his anger was kindled. So he left. Just walked out. Went back home to his parents. And his wife very quickly took up with the guy that had been the best man. So you understand, what a fine bunch of people we're dealing with here. After a while, a few months went by, Samson decided he was going to go back and patch things up. And when he got down there, he said, I thought I'd come back and visit my wife. And her father said, no, well, don't think you can do that. He says, I figured you just walked on out, and so she's living with another guy now. Here, why don't you take her younger sister? Samson got mad about that. So he went out and he trapped 300 foxes. He took firebrands, turned tail to tail, and put a firebrand in between the two tails, and turned all these foxes loose. And this was harvest time, and it burned up the shocks of grain and devastated a lot of the grain fields of the Philistines. So the Philistines were all upset about what had transpired. Now there was enough of a furor that was raised that the Philistines began to put pressure on the men of Judah to deliver Samson to them. And the men of Judah came up to Samson and said, look, the Philistines are rulers over us and you're antagonizing them. You've done these things and, we want to take you down and deliver you to them. So they did so. When the Philistines came down there to take him, Samson burst the bands that bound him and found the new jawbone of an ass in verse 15, put forth his hand and took it and slew 1,000 men. And then he threw away the jawbone and named the place Ramoth Lehi. Lehi means jawbone. So this was the place of the lifting up of the jawbone. And we find that Samuel judged Israel in the days of the Philistines during a 20-year period. 20 years from 1101 down to 1081. The time Samson came on the scene and began to exercise authority about the same time as the ignominious rout of the Israelites and the capture of the ark and the death of Phinehas and Hophni. This was about the time that Samson came to maturity, just as about the same time Samuel came to maturity. Now, this same 20-year period we read of back in the book of 1 Samuel, this was a 20-year period Samuel was in waiting. Samson was the one who was preeminent. He was the one who was supposed to be judging Israel. But what was Samson doing? Well, the only thing he did against the Philistines were when he had some personal grudge to settle. In chapter 16 and verse 1, Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot. So he decided to stop by, not being one to pass up an occasion. And so he stayed there the night. And here he was, still hanging around the Philistines, you see. And word got out that Samson was there in the city. And so about midnight, Samson got up and he took the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts and he went with them, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, carried them to the top of a hill that's before Hebron. And a little while afterward, he met Delilah. Here in verse 4, the lords of the Philistines came to her and they said, we want you to entice him. We want to find the secret of his strength. Now, as the story goes on, she enticed him on these occasions to tell her the secret of his strength, and he wouldn't tell her the truth. He would make up something. And then she would say, she would wake him up and say, the Philistines are on you. And immediately he would break the bands or he would do whatever. And of course the Philistines were there, but they were in hiding and he never saw them. And she would call out to him though, and he would jump up, and it became apparent that whatever he had told her, he just made up. Well, she wheedled and cried and moaned and groaned. And finally, after the third time, he told her. And told her that he was a Nazirite. Now, Samson had never given any particular evidence of being especially religious. In fact, the very opposite. But he was a Nazirite. And at least in terms of the vow of not cutting his hair, that part of the vow had been fulfilled. God had continued to work through Samson for a period of 20 years. To work through Samson in a remarkable way on occasion. Because Samson only took action against the Philistines on occasion, out of personal grudge. What Samson did, he did for the wrong reasons. But God can work through a variety of circumstances. Now, God prepared to work with Samson. Samson, of course, you know the story. Delilah cut his hair. The Philistines came in. They took him prisoner. And we're told that the Philistines took him. In verse 21, they put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza, bound with fetters, and put him to grinding grain in a prison house. They hitched him up like an animal to push a grinding stone around, hitched him to a post like an animal, and he was walking around in a circle grinding grain day in and day out, blind as he could be. But in the weeks and the months that went by, as Samson walked around and around in a circle all day long, grinding grain, unable to see. The amazing thing is, for the first time in his life, Samson began to really see. You see, as long as he had eyes, he was spiritually blind. Once he lost his sight, for the first time, he began to have some vision. He began to see himself. And he must have, in all of the sense of shame and humiliation as he contemplated his wasted life, everything that he had thrown away, the tremendous high calling that he had had set before him, and the way that he had dissipated his energies, the way that he had misused the resources God had given him, had wasted them in all sorts of ways. And he went around and around in a circle, day after day after day, grinding grain, treated like an animal. Finally, the time came for the Philistines to have a great religious occasion in honor of Dagon, their god. And they decided to bring Samson into the temple and to put him on public display. Samson, in the course of this time, and perhaps upwards of a year had passed, Samson at this time had come to a point as he must have prayed far more in that period of time than all the rest of the about 40 years of his life. As he besought God for mercy and for forgiveness, and as he realized the occasion that he was being brought to, and all of the leadership of the Philistines was gathered together. The practice there in the temple, the top had a flat roof, and the banquet was on the roof, and Samson was underneath, and there in the temple area, bound here before Dagon. And Samson desired to atone for a wasted life. God had raised him up to destroy the leadership of the Philistines. Samson had never done that, not in the way that God had desired. He'd never delivered his people. Samson besought God in prayer and said, if you'll give me one more chance, even though it means my own life, I will destroy this group. God imparted once again the miraculous strength to Samson. He took the middle pillars of the temple and pushed, and they fell, and the whole place collapsed. And of course, Samson was killed along with the leadership of the Philistines, 3,000 people, which was more than he had done in the preceding 20 years. Now, this period, this occasion in 1081, the death of Samson, 20 years after the rout of the Israelites and the death of Phinehas and Hophni, 20 years that Samuel sort of stood on the sidelines, ministering to God very quietly. We're told that at this particular occasion, at the end of this 20-year period, back in 1 Samuel, that in 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 2, that 20 years passed, and at the end of this 20 years, Samuel spoke unto all the house of Israel, in verse 3 of 1 Samuel 7, and said, if you return to the Lord with all your hearts, put away your strange gods, and the Lord will save you, and deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. And the children of Israel put away the false gods. Samuel gathered them together to Mizpah and prayed to God for them. The people were called upon to fast and confess their sins. The Philistines came down against the Israelites, which were gathered at Mizpah. And the children of Israel said to Samuel, verse 8, cease not to cry unto the eternal our God for us, and He will save us out of the hand of the Philistines. And Samuel offered a sacrifice to God, and the Eternal thundered with a great thunder and destroyed the Philistine armies. The men of Israel went out of Mizpah, pursued the Philistines, and smote them. And Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and called the name of it Ebenezer, and said, here has the Lord helped us. So the Philistines were subdued in 1081 BC, and they came no more to the coast of Israel. The hand of the Eternal was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. And we find that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and went in a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, and returned back to his home in Ramah. And he judged Israel and built an altar unto the Eternal. Samson and Samuel, two Nazarites, coming on the scene in Israel at the same time, destined to be servants of God from their mother's womb, taking two very different paths. Samson finally repented, but you know, Samson in some ways is sort of like the Laodiceans. They're told that they're indicted for being spiritually blind. God says, you know, your self-evaluation, the Laodiceans were told in Revelation 3, that final stage of the history of God's church, is told that they have an inflated opinion of themselves, that they think they're rich and increased with goods, have need of nothing, and yet they don't realize that they're wretched and poor and miserable and blind and naked. They are destitute, but they don't see themselves. They have no vision spiritually. And just as many of those they consist of those who in many cases will only finally come to an awareness of what they've been in the process of throwing away during the tribulation. You know, there are many of those like Samson who are going to find themselves in the midst of the tribulation, and at that point begin to wake up and realize how lackadaisical, how careless, how contemptuous of God's calling they've been. How careless of it. how they've dissipated their energies and their resources, how they've not valued what God set before them. They lack vision. Samuel, on the other hand, prepared himself to be ready when God opened the door. When God prepared to use Samuel, when God opened the door before Samuel, Samuel was ready to walk through. You know, the statement that Jesus Christ made to the church at Philadelphia, He said, I've set before you an open door that no man can open. He said, I open doors and no man can open them, and no man can close them. And He said, I close doors and no man can open them. Jesus Christ is the one who sets before His church either the open door or the closed door. And when the door is closed, we have to be prepared for when God chooses to open it. It's not a matter of knocking the door down. It's a matter of looking to Jesus Christ as the living head. Samson and Samuel made quite a contrast in their lives. They started out at the same time in the same way. And yet their lives took very different turns. Samson finally learned a bitter lesson. He finally gained that sight, that vision that he had ignored for all those years. Samuel, on the other hand, was able to function and be led of God and serve God for many, many productive years. God's people are enjoined and admonished, and we can all learn from this example. We might close in Proverbs 24 and verse 10, a warning to all of God's people. If you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. If when the times get rough, you decide to sort of flake out and drop by the wayside, your strength is small. Anybody can stick around during the good times. Anybody can be full of strength and confidence when everything is going well and when the sailing is smooth and the road is easy. That's not a problem. If you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. If you forbear to deliver them that are drawn unto death and those that are ready to be slain, well, that's this whole world. We have a commission. We have a job. If you say, behold, we knew it not, does not he that ponders the heart consider it, and does not he that keeps your soul, does he not know it, and shall he not render to every man according to his works? God has before us a calling, a great and precious calling. If we allow our energies to be dissipated, if we turn our attention elsewhere and dissipate our energies, whether on strife, whether on, as Christ warned against, eating and drinking with the drunken or beginning to smite our fellow servants, if we dissipate our energies, whether it's in the internal strife of smiting fellow servants or whether it is in becoming involved and entangled with the world around us, eating and drinking with the drunken, if we dissipate our energies as Samson did, we're going to be in for a very bitter conclusion. If, on the other hand, we walk with God, as Samuel did, we can and will be used of God to accomplish His purposes. You know, God will accomplish His purpose. But you see, will God work through us because of us or in spite of us? Most of what God did through Samson, He did in spite of Samson. And Samson had to go through some bitter experience to finally come to repentance. If we yield ourselves as a willing servant, God will take and use us in a powerful way. We need to learn the lesson of two Nazarites. And we need to examine our own lives. And we need to understand, as God inspired Solomon to write in the book of Proverbs, and as Mr. Tkach admonished us last week, where there is no vision, The people perish. But he that keeps the law, happy is he.